President Joe Biden said the U.S. military is low on 155mm artillery shells in July 2023. The White House attempted to walk back the statement, but estimates do show it'll take 5 years to restock the arsenal of artillery shells, 6 years for Stinger missiles, and 5 years for Javelin missiles, raising concerns about the U.S. ability to respond in the event of a crisis in the Pacific. However, there are conflicting reports from other military experts that say these claims of NATO ammo shortages are vastly overblown. So what's really going on here? Either way, this has actually revealed wider issues within the modern-day military-industrial complex. The US military now faces 3 challenges to their supply chain, including lean manufacturing techniques, access to supplies of rare earths, and advanced semiconductor chips. Why will it take so long? Can't you just throw oodles of money at the problem to fix it tomorrow? Not necessarily. The US Army discovered they need to boost production of 155 artillery shells from the current rate of 14,000 per month up to 85,000 shells by 2028. There are 2 reasons for this: to sustain deliveries to Ukraine, while also accounting for what's called the DoD's operational plans. OP plans are basically contingency plans created for potential wars with countries like Russia or China. So OP plans are a document that the US Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is required to create by law, if you were wondering what he does in his spare time. It states the US needs X amount of 155mm artillery shells on the shelf just in case a war with China or North Korea breaks out. So the DoD is increasing production 6-fold because estimates from earlier this year state that in 5 days, the Ukrainian military likely burns through more artillery shells than the US produces an entire month. Why will it take so long to ramp up production? Since 1953, the US Army has forged artillery shells at Scranton Army Ammunition Plant in Pennsylvania, which has been run by General Dynamics since 2006. Scranton is good for more than making paper. Then in Tennessee, BAE Systems employees mix together 24 pounds of explosives for the shells. Then it's poured into a shell at a factory in rural Iowa. So it's not the lack of materials. The US actually has enough raw materials stockpiled to create the artillery. But what they lack is the heavy equipment used to make the shells. These specialized machines for artillery production are actually giant, the size of entire buildings. You can't just go buy one at your local thrift store from Macklemore. To remedy this, the US Army is now under contract to create a brand new artillery shell production facility in Canada and Garland, Texas, while expanding facilities in Iowa and Kansas. This surge production will take years to create and require an investment of $1 billion each year over the next 15 years. Part of this will go towards modernizing the facilities. As we've seen, shells aren't made the same way they were in the 1950s for the Korean War. Today, robotic arms are used to help create the artillery shells faster, safer, and more precisely. It's like Sun Tzu famously said, "Don't get high on your own supply." Or was that Scarface? Each 155mm shell is a little under 3 feet long and weighs about 100 pounds. It's powerful enough to kill enemy soldiers within 150 feet of the impact and can injure up to 400 feet away. This is why the vast majority of casualties in a high-intensity conflict like Ukraine are likely from this weapon. So I think part of the reason why some people are claiming the US military is short on 155 artillery comes down to the public and myself not really knowing exactly how many of these munitions have been stockpiled in the past. We can use something I like to call average infantryman math to guesstimate. In it, we'll assume the US has been pumping out like 10,000 rounds per month for the past 40 years since 1980. So that would mean, hypothetically, the US stockpiled over 4 million shells. Now that's not accounting for training rounds expended, or past foreign aid, or anything else. This isn't any kind of official audit, it's just a thought experiment. Remember, this isn't fancy officer math, so we know the US military has already sent 1 million 155 shells to Ukraine. Now, there are some people who believe that the US shelves are completely empty, and the NATO arsenal is in a weakened state, unable to respond to those con plans. But there is some evidence to suggest that NATO stockpiles have deep pockets. Allegedly, the US Pentagon has turned to some of its alternative stockpiles of artillery shells. 300,000 rounds are reportedly moved from stockpiles in Israel, and approximately 500,000 artillery shells were sent from South Korea to the United States in order to backfill. Sometimes you gotta be like a squirrel, you gotta hide your nut for winter and then go dig it up when you're ready years later. But this speaks to a much larger problem within the defense industry production called lean manufacturing. Defense companies in America they're similar to just about any company in the United States. They will try to maximize their profits and efficiency. So in 2009, the top 5 defense companies in the United States adopted something called lean manufacturing. This is a least cost production model at the expense of capacity and delivery speed. Lean manufacturing was originally created in 1988, pioneered by Toyota Car Company, on the principle of having an extremely low inventory, so no extra spare parts needed, no potential for waste. This works great when I get my 2012 Toyota Camry dirt cheap, but it's not so great when I run out of artillery shells on the front line. So the hidden cost of lean manufacturing is less stockpiles. The Pentagon's top procurement official, William LaPlante, put it this way, quote, "One person's efficiency is another person's vulnerability." But to be fair, a RAND study found direct labor hours required to produce parts declined by up to 81%, so there are huge benefits to using lean manufacturing. Can't we just innovate ourselves out of the problem? In the past, America has always found ways to innovate when faced with defense production shortages. Just look at World War II. President Franklin D. Roosevelt called America's defense production capability the arsenal of democracy. But this took a full 5 years to build for World War II. In World War II, equipment mainly required simple steel, iron, and sweat to produce, all within one country. However, today it takes more than 200 advanced semiconductors to create a single Javelin missile system with components and skills that come from around the world. So the increased complexity of weapons production today might make ramping up production more of a challenge. You might think the American HIMARS rocket artillery is made entirely in the United States, but it actually requires the cooperation of companies from around the world in the United Kingdom, Turkey, and France to produce. In total, 141 cities and towns across 28 different United States and 3 different countries are represented in the HIMARS and guided rocket supply chain. This cooperation and collaboration across the world is what makes weapons in the Western world the most effective and reliable ever in human history. When I hear corporate platitudes about how diversity is the greatest strength, it usually makes me roll my eyes. But this is one example where I think that's truly the case. Our diversity of expertise across many countries allowed us to specialize skills and create the best weapon systems technologies in the world. But outsourcing these parts of production is also part of why the defense supply chain is so vulnerable. If we're going to talk about the strengths of diversity, we need to also make sure we're addressing the weaknesses. So how is the defense industry trying to fix these problems and successfully surge production rates? It largely comes down to multi-year contracts. The defense industrial base can't scale up without contractual security and certainty. They need ink to paper, guarantees that funding will be predictable from Congress. This means authorizing multi-year-long contracts with long lead purchases for materials and even a willingness to spend taxpayer money on weapon systems that may never even end up being used. But some of you might have already guessed what the potential problem is here. What if in the somewhat unlikely event, President Biden and Xi Jinping start dating tomorrow? What if North Korea and Russia have a change of heart and they find a way to legally join NATO? That would mean all of this increased production would be a massive waste. This is the unpredictable pickle that the defense industry is currently in. This is the price of increased production capacity. And to their credit, Congress actually recently approved new, multi-year defense contracts for the Army. One signal to look for is an increase in the workforce size. In 1985, for instance, during the Cold War, the US had 3 million workers in the defense industry, but in 2021, there are only 1.1 million, and that number isn't growing. yet. So now this could be because many of the jobs can be done with robots today, but we should still be looking for an increase in the numbers of employees in the defense industry. It's also true that there are far less defense companies to work for today. In the 1990s, there was a consolidation of the defense industry that went from 51 prime defense contractors down to 5 today. This consolidation means that if subcontractors cannot source materials, it has a ripple effect on multiple weapon systems that end up going offline. Mark F. Cancian, a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, does say there is some reason for optimism here because most US military inventories are still good to go. The potential shortages in guided missiles and artillery do not represent the full spectrum of the US arsenal. We also have to keep in mind that there are many weapon substitutions, so even if we end up with a shortage of inventory in Javelin missiles, there's a huge stockpile of existing TOW missiles. 176,000 have been manufactured. Foreign policy writer Jack Desch wrote a great article on how these ammunition shortages might not even be relevant today because stockpiles may be larger than required. Thousands of 155mm rounds were already set aside for a potential war with Russia, but that war will likely never be fought because Ukrainian forces currently have them tied up. So we essentially haven't adjusted for or accounted for the fact that those set aside munitions are no longer needed. A White House official tried to clarify Joe Biden's statements about the US running low on artillery ammo, stating everything we send to Ukraine is in excess of our contingency plans, so the US is not running out of ammunition ourselves. Some claim the fact that the US is sending cluster munitions to Ukraine indicates that they're running short on artillery shells and are using that as a stopgap while they ramp up production. The second major supply chain vulnerability that you need to know about is China's grip on rare earths. 15 rare earths are identified by the US Department of Defense as critical for the production of high-tech weapon systems. For example, an F-35 fighter jet requires a staggering 920 pounds or 417 kilograms of rare earths to manufacture. These elements are actually pretty common in the Earth's crust, but extracting and refining them is very expensive and difficult, and why they're called rare. The United States was once the leader in rare earth mining from the 1960s through the 1980s. But China spent 5 decades investing in national programs and laboratories for rare earths. In 1990, the CCP identified rare earth metals as a strategic resource, throwing more government support behind it. As a result, many Western rare earth mining companies went bankrupt in the mid-1990s. The US was actually sort of alright with what they thought was China doing their dirty work, because there are significant environmental concerns associated with this mining industry. For example, 1 ton of rare earth elements can generate up to 60,000 cubic meters of waste gas. Stringent US environmental regulations and heightened ecological awareness in America deterred companies from fully exploiting their own country's domestic rare earth production. In 2010, Washington saw the writing on the wall and attempted to restore its domestic production capacity with Molycorp opening a rare earth mine in California, but their extraction was incredibly low quality, leading to their bankruptcy in 2015. By 2010, China had dominated every aspect of rare earth metal supply chain production, with about 95% of raw materials, 97% of oxides, and about 90% of alloys. Therefore, China's control over the rare earth element supply chain is synonymous with China having its boot over the defense industry, well, partially. China knows this, and they've already sought to weaponize this resource. In 2021, Beijing asked their industry executives directly if proposed restrictions and sanctions would harm Western contractors. Specifically, the Chinese government wanted to know how badly they could hurt production of the American F-35 if they cut off supply of rare earths. Beijing halted all shipments of rare earths to Japan for almost 2 months in 2010. This disrupted Japan's automotive industry and triggered an international race to secure rare earths. Beijing has leveled damaging sanctions against American defense companies like Lockheed Martin in 2020 and again to Raytheon in 2023 to limit the ability to send over $1 billion worth of missiles and artillery to Taiwan. And back in my day, we fought wars over oil like real men. How is the United States trying to fix this problem? The Trump administration published an executive order in 2017 named a federal strategy to ensure secure and reliable supplies of critical minerals. And as the first step, the Pentagon agreed to fund a company called MP Materials with $35 million, which restarted excavations at the Mountain Pass mine in California's Mojave Desert. Now, it's certainly not all doom and gloom. The US is reported to have enough supply of rare earths for up to 6 months of defense applications. Some of the US's closest allies, like Australia, are major exporters of this resource. But if something were to happen to the global supply chain, it would be a major problem. These executive orders show the US is finally taking extensive action on securing its rare earth element supply chain. The final vulnerability to the US supply chain that you need to know about is semiconductor chips. All major US defense systems and platforms rely on semiconductors for their performance, such as satellites, stealth aircraft, and cruise missiles, and most importantly, the future AI technologies. Taiwan commands a monopoly over this component, producing about 90% of the world's leading semiconductors. One step Washington has taken is to kneecap China's domestic semiconductor industry. In October 2022, the Biden administration imposed a ban on exporting high-end AI chips to any organization operating in China, as 95% of all AI chips currently used in China are NVIDIA GPUs. So this prohibition is expected to have a severe impact on China's domestic chip market. AI is seen by leaders like General Mark Milley as the next paradigm shift in warfare, meaning whoever has the best AI may win the next war. This is why the US devoted $280 billion to the 2022 CHIP and Science Act to give the US an advanced domestic chip industry. Washington is working closely with TSMC to create 2 fabrication facilities in Arizona that'll reach 3 nanometer level by 2026. TSMC has been understandably reluctant to expand production outside the country. This is because they saw this industry as quote unquote silicon shield. This is the notion that Taiwan's monopoly on semiconductors makes other states reliant on it, thus giving it geopolitical leverage. But pressure from America was able to persuade Taiwan's semiconductor industry to offshore some production. New multi-year defense contracts can help solve the problem of lean manufacturing. New mines opening up, funded by the Pentagon inside of America, can help resolve the rare earth metal problem, and new semiconductor facilities inside the United States will eventually solve the advanced chip shortage. All of this feels to me like we're setting the stage for potentially a new Cold War. The future of America's high-tech weapons supply chain is looking like a complex and high-stakes chess game, both the US and China, each armed with their unique strategic advantages. They're maneuvering to solidify their positions over these strategic resources. If you like this video, check out this one on why Pakistan always seems to be on the very brink of collapse. Hint, I think it might have something to do with their extremely powerful military and all their coups. Well, relatively speaking, powerful to the relationship with their government. Thank you for watching. I'm your average infantryman, Chris Cappy, signing off.